Yeah, hello and welcome back everybody here to Value Added Tax, and this is now part number 96. So you probably already curse your fate, but as I wanted to show you that VAT is far from being unbearable, it's nevertheless sometimes just fraught with some rules which basically after you understood them is or no better, are completely superfluous. So understanding what it is and then basically forgetting them again is very often a very helpful idea. So is it all about? Where are we at the moment? I talked to you recently, a bit more than recently, about different special cases, and well, one on the list is the distinction when we have to deal with a barter transaction and when not. So this is the topic of today, and this will have the following points to discuss. First, what are the basics? So how is barter transactions usually dealt with? Then what's the problem in our case today? What's the key idea behind that solution? When could the whole thing form problems? What is the legal solution in Germany to these problems? And then at the end, naturally, a short summary, and then it's already over. So let's start here, remembering the basics. So what were the basics for barter trade, ladies and gentlemen? Well, that was simple because basically you sell a good and the customer pays you not in cash but gives you a good or service in return. Now, you always have to base your VAT calculation on what you get paid. And so if you don't get paid in cash, you just do as if you have got the market value of the good or service which you get in cash. So basically the trick is if you get involved in a barter trade, what you get, you take the market value and do as if you had that got in cash. So to illustrate that, an example. You are a lawyer. I bet you hope you were. And you give legal advice to a customer, and that customer has a grocery store and a massive financial problems. So he probably can't pay you, and fortunately you are a person who likes some good ideas. So you agree with him that he pays you with 1,000 bars of chocolate, a very exquisite chocolate which he has in stock, and each one of these bars has a value of €3. So you in turn plan to use these chocolate bars for a nice idea. You want to send them to all your clients with some Christmas greetings. So this is the way how you can use them. And so you think, okay, better than nothing. Good. Now, how do you deal with such a deal? Well, the first and most fundamental rule for such cases is already mentioned. You remember that here are two transactions. A sells something to B, that's one transaction which you have to evaluate, and B sells something to A, and so you have to run the testing scheme for both of the transactions separately, one after another. So what you do now, once you find that out, is you structure the situation as two different transactions. First, we have a lawyer. Let's assume he's from Ludwigshafen in Germany, and he gives legal advice to a trader from Tübingen, also in Germany, and the trader pays him with a value of 3,000. So that's number one. Number two is the trader in turn sells chocolate to the lawyer, and the lawyer pays with services, and if the transaction is fair, then the services evidently have the same value as the chocolate. So it's a reasonable assumption that the service of the lawyer also has a value of 3,000, a market value, so a gross value. Now, in order to solve that case, you would simply have to run the first or the testing scheme on the first transaction and then on the second, because these are basically two completely different cases. Now you know how both have to look like. So if we want to do this, we simply should do this, and this is what I'm going to do with you immediately. Then let's start. Taxability. Well, we have to test 1.1 number 1 because the only viable alternative would be 1.1 number 5, intra-community acquisition, and it's far from even imaginable that this could be the case here. So we end up with that what we always test by in case of taxability. So 5 criteria which we remember. So the first one is the lawyer is an entrepreneur according to how it's defined in paragraph 2, 1 sentences 1 and 3 of the German Umsatzsteuergesetz. He also acts within the range of his enterprise, the scope of his entrepreneurial activities, because you remember that everything belongs to his entrepreneurial sphere, which happens in the course of his activities. So either his main business or everything which might from time to time occasionally occur in the course of that business. And definitively giving legal advice is definitively the job of a lawyer, so is covered. He also acts for consideration and not for free, because he demands something in return, the chocolate. So that's already done. So let's have a look to the 2 interesting criteria. Is it a good or is it a service? Well, our lawyer gets chocolate, but what he does is he gives advice, and advice is a service because it's not a tangible good. One might even polemically say what a lawyer gives as advice is probably never good. So 3.9 says this is a service. And then we still have to determine the place of the service. And here you please remember that the place of service is a completely artificial criterion, which has nothing to do with, or at least has nothing necessarily to do with where our lawyer works. So in case that he does something for the business of his trader customer, then the place of service is just determined by law as 3a2, the place where his customer has established his business. That would be Tübingen, that's in Germany. So the whole thing is taxable under the condition that 3a paragraphs 3 to 8 do not change anything. They don't. So yes, indeed, it's taxable in Germany. Now, the next question is there a tax exemption? And the answer is no, there is not. Let's assume that the lawyer is not blind, otherwise I would have told you so. So then blindness would have been for number 19, a peculiarity in the German tax law. However, fully liable to tax, no exemption. So tax base, everything he gets is the gross amount minus the VAT amount included therein that has to be deducted. This is 19 out of 119%, so 478.99. And what comes out as a net amount, and so as our tax base is 2,521.01, and the tax has to be computed on that. The tax rate is 19%, as we already said, and the tax is, as we also already said, 478.99. So the next aspects are rather trivial ones. Who has to pay? That's the entrepreneur. That's here the lawyer, because paragraph 13b does not apply. We don't have any case where we have to bother about 13b here. So reverse charge, you remember that? The tax point, as the English say, or the arisal of the tax, as sometimes the EU directive would nicely and complicated, in a complicated way put it, is 13.1 number 1 at the end of that preliminary declaration period in which the service was rendered. Yes, and nothing peculiar concerning invoicing details or declaration duties. anything very, very special, false invoice or something like that. No, is not there. Apart from, yes, he has to write an invoice and confirm VAT so that the trader can deduct the input tax. And the trader has then the right to deduct the input tax if he has got a formal invoice, because the advice has been a service which we assume was done for entrepreneurial motives to him. First transaction done. Second transaction, you remember what it was. The trader sells chocolate to the lawyer. The lawyer takes it and pays with his services, evidently having a value of 3,000. So taxability again. Now the entrepreneur is the trader because he sells the chocolate. He acts also within the scope of his enterprise because selling the food is the core business of a grocery and food business. He acts for consideration because he demands something in return. He wants to have the legal services of the lawyer. For him, it's the delivery because chocolate is good, and he gives away the position like an owner, or, to put it correctly, even here, ownership in the chocolate. So 3-1 is fulfilled, and the place of delivery of the chocolate is to be determined under paragraph 3.6, sentence 1. That's there where at that point where the movement of that good towards the customer begins in order to fulfill the delivery. That's Tübingen. That's in Germany, so the whole thing is taxable because all the 5 conditions for taxability are fulfilled. Next question, is there a tax exemption? No, there is no tax exemption for chocolate. Is there the tax base? How can we compute it? Yes, that's again 3,000, the value of all he gets in return. 3,000 is the assumed value of the legal advice he gets. So that's his gross payment. The VAT amount has to be deducted from that. Now the VAT for chocolate is 7%, so 7 out of 107% are deducted. The remaining amount is 2803.73, and that means that's the net amount for the chocolate. Tax rate and tax, 7% for chocolate is the tax rate in Germany under paragraph 12.2. Number 1 in combination with number 30 of supplement 2 to the UStG, the Umsatzsteuergesetz. Their chocolate and products made from chocolate are mentioned as reduced rate products. So we have the tax as 7% of 2,803, and if I computed that correctly, that would be 196.27. And again, let's go to the rest. Formal aspects. The taxpayer for this amount is now the trader. The arisal of the tax or tax point is again the end of that declaration period in which the chocolate was delivered. Anything special? Probably no. And input tax, probably the lawyer can deduct the input tax for the chocolate because he bought it for entrepreneurial purposes. He wants to do some marketing activity, sending the chocolate together with a nice Christmas card to all his former, present and future clients to make some good mood and motivate them to get into legal quarrels again. And yeah, this, by the way, giving away the chocolate for as a Christmas present or Christmas greeting to the customers will also not constitute a case for a withdrawal taxation because that's just a gift of small value, so unimportant, doesn't trigger a consumer taxation. Now you again know the tricks of how barter transactions have to be dealt with, and so now we can come to our problem of today. So how can I best illustrate the problem? The best idea is probably we start with the case so that you can see what might be the issue. You imagine that the private customer asks a painter what it would cost to paint the facade of his house. And now when the answer comes, he gets a shock because the painter says this work would cost 10,000 euro. Now the customer is a bit unhappy, so he asks why. And the painter says, well, among other things, I need a scaffold, so where I can climb up with my people and paint the facade, because if I paint the facade on the 3rd floor and there is no scaffold, then I would need to fly, and I can't fly. Then he needs to buy the necessary paint, and he is going to do all the painting work himself. However, he needs to hire for that 1 or 2 days or a week, however long it lasts. He needs to hire an unskilled worker for assistance services like could you please bring me a beer? And now when the customer hears that cost calculation, the customer comes to the idea, what about changing things a bit? I have a scaffold of my own which could easily be used, so that the 1,000 euro for that cost element can be completely saved. I also have a sufficient amount of paint in stock at hand, so you don't need to buy paint. I have paint. And you don't need an unskilled worker, because instead of you hiring an unskilled worker to support you, I take a day off or 2 or 3 days off, and I'm going to do all these services which you need. And I'm perfectly unskilled, so you will be happy with me. So we can save another 1,000 euro of cost. And if we take all that into consideration, can't we change things like this? And so you do the job for only 7,000. And now, surprise, the painter says, yeah, it's okay, I'm fine with that. So we do it this way. Customer brings the scaffold, brings the paint, brings himself, and only pays 7,000. Now the decisive question is, was this now only one transaction? So the painter does a service for, sorry, printing mistake 7,000 for the customer, or is it a barter transaction? A painter does a facade painting which originally, we heard, has a value of 10,000, and the customer pays him partly in cash and partly with own services and partly with paint. One might argue what I get is a complete facade painting that has a market value of 10,000, and I don't pay it all in cash. I pay it partly by handing over goods on my own or services of my own. Now, that problem can be easily solved if you remember the basic definitions of what a delivery of a good is and what the supply of a service is. Because if it's a barter transaction, then our customer would have to make a delivery of the paint to the painter, a service to the painter in form of his work, and a rental service in form of the scaffold. So a delivery of a good means that you give somebody else the ability to dispose about a tangible good like an owner. So tangible good could here only be the paint. And so is this definition fulfilled in our case? And the answer is, if we look at precisely what happens here, it's not the case, because the painter never gets the paint as his own property. He's not allowed to use it for his own purposes at his own will. The only thing he can do with the paint is use it for the purpose of the house of the customer, according to the instructions of the customer. So the painter never gets any position like an owner with regard to that paint. So there is no delivery of the paint. The paint never changes owner. So that's evidently excluded. So no logical basis for a barter trade insofar. Next element, a service is something which you do for someone else. So basically you do something where the other person profits from or what the other person wants. In our case, the customer does not only do any work for the painter because he only works on his own house for his own purposes and under his own instructions. He never can be seen as an employee of the painter. The painter has no possibility to dispose about that work time. So the painter never gets anything for himself. Same logic as the customer working at the construction site where the scaffold is built up, and so he only works for himself, for his own purposes. So the painter doesn't get anything for himself. So no service of customer rendered to the painter. So again, no basis for a barter transaction, because if the painter gets paid partly in form of that service, he would need to get that service, but he doesn't. Same is true with the scaffold. It's not rented to the painter because the painter can never do anything with the scaffold what he wants to do with it during a limited time. He can only use it for the purpose of painting that house. So he basically never gets any disposal possibilities about that scaffold. So he again gets nothing here. So if we sum up that situation, the result is easy. If a customer provides us some materials or some activities which are necessary to accomplish a project, then the customer basically keeps these things to himself, for himself, works for himself. So this is done by himself for himself. So here is the scaffold, the owner on top helping with the paint, carrying it up and down and so, and only the work and the deliveries which remain to be done are done by the painter. So the painter only does the 7,000 euro remaining amount of work, and the rest never is delivered or rendered as a service. There is nothing else. So in that situation, you see from the logical analysis, the painter only does the remaining work. So VAT can only be charged on the 7,000. When would the situation change a bit? It would change if the paint which the customer supplies turns out to be absolutely not suitable for the facade painting of the house, but the painter, being a very nice guy and seeing that the customer has financial problems otherwise, says, okay, I keep your paint for a suitable occasion because it's not shit, it's just not fitting your walls. So I take your paint and I use own paint for your house. Because in that case, it would be a barter transaction. Now the painter gets ownership in the customer's paint and can use it for his own purposes. Painting the walls of other people's houses. That means he can dispose about it like an owner in the future. So that would make that paint a part of the payment for the painter. That's clear. The same if the painter, after a short time, thinks, okay, the customer offered me to work for me as the unskilled supporter whom I need. However, I could never imagine how unskilled the guy was. So he's entirely unfit to help me on the scaffold and bring things up and down and so on. So I can't use the guy. I need to take some other supporter. However, I know he has otherwise financial problems. Now let's think, what could he do for me? Well, let's agree on you do twice the time in my garden, because after you told me what you do with your garden, I found out you are absolutely able. You're very fine and skilled in doing garden work. So you do garden work for me and I do all the rest. In that case, a service, the working time of the customer is now done for purposes of the painter, so it becomes a part of the consideration. This is now a kind of payment. I accept that you don't give me 1,000 in cash, but do gardening work for me. So that would turn it into a barter transaction. Okay, so to sum up, very simple idea. If your counterpart in the contract gets something for himself, that makes it a part of the consideration of the payment. If you just contribute something for the production of the product or service which is going to be your own, then you never give anything to your counterpart. So then your counterpart just supplies the missing parts of the whole final product, and only that is charged with VAT, because then we don't have no logical basis for a barter trade interpretation of what happens. Okay, good. So far. So, where do we have special problems? Because, yeah, there one might be a bit helpless in deciding if there is barter trade or not. A standard example or a standard constellation where problems arise is usually illustrated by the example of somebody, a farmer going to a mill and wanting that the miller changes or processes his, let's call, wheat or corn into wheat meal. Yeah, we have here that farmer, and he arrives with his horse on a wagon, a small little car, wagon, and hands over, as you easily see, the sacks of wheat to the farmer. And €10 for the work. The miller or owner of the mill then does all these sacks of wheat to his mill, processes them, and then hands them back to the farmer, as you easily see here. That's evidently a service. He took the things, grinded them, processed them, and gave them back. Now the evident problem is what happens if the mill is not able to separate exactly these sacks of wheat or corn from the other sacks of wheat and corn which are processed in the mill. Then you get back just 3 sacks of wheat, but you can't swear in court that it's exactly what you possessed before. And in that case, you might get back not your own wheat, but other wheat. So you would transfer ownership of your wheat to the owner of the mill, and you would get back sacks of wheat which was not yours before. Does that make it a barter transaction? Now, every person who has some reasonable idea of reality would say, who cares? Now, law people might care, and that's where we have to think about. So the situation would now be here again. You give wheat to the miller, and he gets his €10. And now the mill guy puts it to the mill, and now he tells you, well, you don't need to wait for hours or so until I can deal with your sacks, because I already have 3 finished sacks of exactly your sort of wheat or corn or whatever grain you brought to me, so I can hand them over to you. That speeds up the situation a bit, and that's it. Now you can go. And the question is, should this really make a difference? From a very formal point of view, no. This could, because you get something which you didn't own before, and you gave away something which you don't get back. So it could be seen as a barter of an exchange of goods, one against the other. In economic reality, nobody cares because what you get back is sets of weight meal. So it's exactly the same as what your own stuff would become. So nobody cares. Nobody marks the grain to make sure that he gets back exactly the same grains. You are satisfied in getting back the identical quantity and the identical quality of your own product, and the fine details don't matter. So because these products are exchangeable, and so nobody cares. From an economic point of view, you just give your product to be processed and you get the final product back, and nobody cares if it's really made from exactly your material or from that of others. What matters is that you get back what you gave virtually. However, law people might care about the formal distinction, and to make sure that even judges and fiscal officers dare to give in to reality and not to formal illusions. In order to clarify this and make it sure, German law explicitly clarifies the situation in paragraph 3, section 10 UStG, and says there that if an entrepreneur gets from a customer goods which shall be processed by him and hands back to that customer goods of the same kind which he uses to process from these products, so gets grain, gives back me, I hope so. Then this is still to be seen as a service, well, because reality matters. The only situation where that would be dealt with differently would be if the two really treat it as a kind of a barter, so that somebody says, I give you my wheat, which has a value of 100 euro, and you sell me back a sack of processed wheat which has a value of, so that they really treat it as sale and sale back. But they usually don't do. Usually the miller says, here, I charge you for my work, and then it's a service. So you might even hand in your sacks of grain and immediately take in return finished processed grains of the same quality and the same quantity corresponding to what you handed in. Nobody cares. It's just treated as a service by the miller, and that makes sense. Okay. Special constellation number 2, a similar one. That deals with the situation that you give something to an entrepreneur, allow him to take out some parts of what you gave him, and you insist on getting the rubbish or the waste or what remains back. Again, that is a question where one could say, yeah, you give to the other guy something, and what you get back is not the same good as before because it has been destroyed. What you get back is separate parts of it. So under a formal point of view, you get something else back than you gave away. So is that again a barter transaction? Could one say you gave a certain material to the other guy and he produced some new thing which you got in addition as a payment for your original good which you gave away. So you get something different back plus money. Is that the right way to see it? And that's again a bit abstract, and so it would be a good idea to illustrate it with a concrete example. Standard example in textbooks is milk. You bring it to a plant or factory where the cream is extracted, and they pay you for the cream and hand you back the milk without the cream, so the cream reduced or cream deprived milk. One could construe this as you give away full milk and you get paid by money plus cream reduced milk in return. That would make it a barter deal. You could also interpret it differently. You only give away the cream. Why is it of importance? Let's assume the full milk has a value of 1,000 euro. The cream extracted has a value of 200, which you know because that is what you get paid for the cream. And most probably then the creamless or the remains of the milk which you get back still have a value of 800. So if it's a barter transaction, then you have to pay 7% out of the 1,000 euro full value of the milk which you give away. And the factory extracts the milk and the cream and gives you back the creamless milk with a value of 800, and you pay for it, or you have paid for it by handing over the full milk. And that would mean 7% out of 800. In that case, the one guy has to pay 65.42 euro and the other guy 52.33. So both have to pay VAT. On the other hand, if the whole transaction is restricted to you just sold the cream and got back the rest, you never handed over ownership of the rest of the material to the factory. Then the VAT is only due on 200, and that's probably some 12 or 13 euro only. And you are the only guy who has to pay VAT. It might even change the rate if a reduced rate would only apply to milk but not to cream. In Germany, however, it does apply to both. However, theoretically, it could also be different. So the total amount of the VAT paid in connection with the transaction is completely different. In a barter interpretation, it would be far higher. And even the tax rate might be different, because sometimes you might say that's something different which has been delivered than if you see the two things in a kind of gross interpretation. For this situation, Germany also has a clarification of how the situation has to be seen from a reasonable economic point of view. They say, okay, if somebody allows somebody else to extract materials from a good which he possesses and insist in getting the remnants back, then only those parts which that person extracts and keeps are delivered. The rest is not delivered, 3.5 UStG. So you only then deliver the goods which the other guy extracts. This is again nothing new, but just common sense, because if I give you, let's say, a computer and you say, I say you can extract some metals which are precious from it and give me back the remaining parts which you can't use, then you never get owner of the parts which I reserve for myself. So you never get the position like an owner with regard to these other parts. And so this is basically nothing special, but evidently people feared that some legal experts might view it differently, and so they codified this clarification in our laws. So to sum that up, what we spoke about today, sometimes there can be difficulties in the analysis of the situation where a customer supplies some of the goods and services needed to accomplish the final wanted result, and he does it himself, or where the customer hands over goods to someone else and gets identical goods or only parts of the original goods back. The problem here is then, can that be seen as we exchange these goods, or is it just, let's say, the net transaction? And the basic idea, which gives you the way to the solution, is always that, well, common sense. What the other person is never allowed to keep and is never allowed to use for himself, that never gives that person a position like an owner. And some activity which you never do for the other person can never be a service to that other person, but you do it entirely for yourself. So these things cannot be exchanged. They cannot form a part of the contract with the other counterpart. They cannot form or establish a barter transaction. You have it and you keep it for yourself. So it's out of the scope of that transaction. The special rules which clarify that interpretation are probably only necessary to even make judges and fiscal officials feel safe if they give in to reality and understand what's going on. Because they have a very formal training, they would probably think about, okay, is it really the same stuff? And so just to clarify things, these rules have been laid down. And now you probably understand why at the beginning I told you there are some rules which you can just hear about, understand them, and then happily probably put them aside and nearly forget about them, because you will never probably actively need them if you understood the system. However, if you ever come across a legal text, have a glance at these rules, you are probably confused, want to understand them, and that's why it's good to have heard about them once in your life, so that you can, let's call it, dig out that knowledge again when at any given point of time in the far or near future you might need it. Good. Yeah, that was my message to you for today. Don't forget the standard recommendation. If you like this video, give it a like, and especially recommend the channel to others whom you like. Naturally, if you didn't like that video, then you know my standard recommendation and request to you already too. If you didn't like that video, then please recommend it to 2 or 3 people whom you don't like. And yeah, that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening, if you did. And see you soon back on the same channel for the next part. Thank you very much and goodbye.